Good morning. So originally we booked in a date for me to speak to you about the up and running community hub and coffee shop. And then, like with much of our lives, the plans you've made and perhaps the plans we're going to make or the practical expression of them may need to change. But the purposes of God have not changed. In fact, if anything, we are wide awake and alert to his purposes more than ever. And I want to talk to you a bit about the purpose behind what we are doing and how we can position ourselves to partner with God in what he is doing and enable us to express the fullness of the purpose that he has. There's one verse which, as we've considered what we are looking to cultivate at the Community Hub, that really stirs my heart and it ignites hope and it expresses vision, and it's this. It's from Isaiah 58 verse 12, and it says, "Your people will build anew on foundations laid long before you. You will be known as repairers of the cities and restorers of communities." Some versions say rebuilder of walls or restorer of homes. And this morning's talk is about how we rebuild and we see the restoration of our communities and of our city. If ever there was a time when God is inviting us and calling us and stirring again the hunger in us to see things change, to see breakthrough, to see his kingdom come here on earth as it is in heaven, then it's now. Restoration is when things are made good, when what time and tragedy have wreaked havoc on are made good. It is the story of hope, one of looking forward in every way to the future, trusting in a God who is faithful and good, and knowing that he is the way maker, the one with whom all things are possible. It is the story of the Bible and the story of God and us. The enemy comes to steal and destroy, but God comes to restore all things, and that we might have life and have it to the full. The Bible is the restoration storybook, from beginning to end and every story in between. But there is one that for me has neon flashing signs pointing towards it at the moment. And it's a story that begins with a people who were uprooted, displaced and dislocated from the place that they had been inhabiting. Sound at all familiar? It's the story about the restoration of a city and of the renewal and reform of God's people as they return to dwell there. This is what we have all been hoping and praying for. It's the story of a man called Nehemiah, who, like the rest of his people, is living in lockdown, or exile, as most versions of the Bible call it. And Nehemiah gets a visit from his brother and some friends who tell him that all is not well, that the people living in Jerusalem are in trouble, that the walls are broken down and the gates are burned with fire. In Jerusalem, we have this earthly picture of the dwelling place of God, the place where his people reside. Jerusalem is a city on a hill, like the one that Jesus talks about, shining for all to see, a picture of the kingdom of heaven, the place where Jesus rules and reigns. There's a verse in Isaiah 60 that talks as well about the walls and gates of Jerusalem, and it says this: "No longer will there be ruin or destruction within your borders," and some versions even say pestilence, "but your walls will be called salvation and your gates praise." The walls that we are called to restore and rebuild are not the impenetrable or defensive walls of a fortified city, but they are the borders of the kingdom. Salvation means saving or deliverance, but it also means help and victory and welfare and healing and health and aid, the help of his presence. It means rescue and safety and freedom, and it's like this picture of just as if you were walking and you encountered a city wall, you would know it was there. And we want people to come up against the borders of the kingdom and see and know and feel what salvation looks like. It's about knowing and encountering God and being made whole, of health and restoration, and of living in peace and thriving. That's what it looks like to live in Jesus' kingdom. As we live under his rule and reign, we are made whole. And the walls of the city, it says, were broad walls, believing and belonging and healing and freedom. These are all part of our salvation. For some they come all at once, but for others of us, one part comes before the others. But God's plan is that we are made whole, body and soul and spirit. They all influence each other, and that's okay. But we have to take care of all three. So how do we help people encounter the King and the kingdom and to experience salvation? Let's go back to the story of Nehemiah. Right at the start, when Nehemiah hears from his brother that all was not well, it says he sat down and wept. It mattered to him. He cared and he engaged, but it was more than that. He cared enough to act. He had compassion. Most of us are soft-hearted and caring enough to be touched when we hear sad news or of tragedy, that all is not well for someone we know and love, or even for someone we don't know and love. But compassion is different. Compassion is when you act, when you do something to alleviate the pain or the suffering of another. It means to suffer with, when someone else's pain becomes your pain. And if you have ever been in pain, you know that you'll mostly do anything to make it go away. You do something about it. Love has to look like something. Nehemiah cries because it matters. And then it says, for some days he fasted and he prayed, and then he acts at great personal cost. If we want to see our city restored, we have to care enough to act, to do something. It takes grit. We have to pursue it. We may be hoping and praying for the restoration of our city, for the kingdom to come here in Southampton as it is in heaven. But it's personal. Further on in the story, when rebuilding has begun and there's opposition, and there often is opposition, and Nehemiah encouraged them as they build, and they've got one hand to building and a knife in the other hand, and he says, fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives and your homes. It starts with our people, our families, our households. It matters, and it's not the story of a building project. It is the story of people. It's our story. The second thing that we see is that God doesn't need highly skilled experts for restoration. He needs availability. And when I say availability, I don't mean having some free time on your hands. Nehemiah lived far away, and he was otherwise engaged. In fact, he was at the top of his game. He had a top job. He was one of the king's most trusted people. It was going really well for him. And he wasn't sat around wondering what cause to give himself to. Nehemiah was a senior official, not a builder or a project manager. But he was willing. And he was living as a man submitted to God and willing to follow wherever and do whatever, to partner with God's plans over and above his own. We see the same thing further on in the story, that God is looking for availability, not experts. The people who are rebuilding the walls are jewelers and perfume makers, they're priests and council workers, they are men and they're women, they're young and they're old. They weren't builders, they didn't have the skills, they weren't particularly suited to the work, but they made themselves available and they were willing and they gave themselves to the task at hand. The next part of the story is the bit that I think is really significant in the here and now. When Nehemiah arrives in the city, he doesn't go with a ready-made plan or as an expert. He doesn't use his connections or go to the important people in the city. Instead, he goes out at night while it is dark to inspect the walls and to find out what state they're in. And I feel like God really spoke to me about this being like the times we are in. It is dark, but it's time for us to consider where the boundaries of the kingdom are. What are they like? Where are they high and where are they low? Where does there need to be some rebuilding and some investment? Where do we need to station people? When I first read the story, I read the names of the gates and the places he went to. But his journey was really significant and carries some wisdom for us in the here and now. Here is where he went. First, he goes to the dung gate, which is what it sounds like. There was probably a lot of dung. And then he goes to the jackal's well, which was called this because it was where the dead things were thrown, and so it's where the scavengers hung out. It's not a nice place to go or to be in. It's uncomfortable to survey and to contemplate. But you have to know the true state of things in order to see restoration. This is where the process of restoration begins. We have to fully engage with what is before we can move on to what will be. It's not where we stay, but we cannot be effective unless we're willing to go there. Next, he tries to get to the fountain gate, called that because it was next to a fountain with a source and supply of ever-flowing water, a picture of our life source from God and the flow of the Holy Spirit to sustain us. And also to the King's Pool, which was a place where people went for healing. It's named as the place where Jesus heals the blind man, where he received his sight and vision. But it says there was so much rubbish that Nehemiah could not pass on his mount. His horse or donkey that he was riding on, as was befitting for a man of his position or ranking. Finally, we are told he re-enters the city by the valley gate. He probably had to walk up the valley, which was actually a graveyard, and enter through the low point of the city. His journey is all about humility. It's about openness and realness. He's unafraid of engaging with mess and with uncomfortableness. He has to push aside fear and offence. He has to dismount to get to the fountain and the King's Pool. We have to lay aside our position and approach with humility if we want to access the life source and to receive healing and vision. We have to be prepared to journey through the valley, through the difficult places, and to enter or to come as we are. So what does that mean for us? What is God saying? I think this is a time when we need to examine where we're at, to inspect our borders, as it were. Along with unprecedented times, one of the comments that you've probably heard most is that we are all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. It's the same as before lockdown, but the crisis has both revealed and accelerated the difference. There's those in our city, in our communities, in our streets, in our workplaces, in our families, who have the odds stacked against them, who face a momentous challenge in life just to even start on a level playing field. I joined the Love Southampton steering group for a call this week. There's an increasing acceleration in the number of those in need of help. The number of debt advice calls in our city have tripled. I spoke to some friends this week too who are on the front line of mental health services, and they were saying, unsurprisingly, there is a wave following the virus of increased mental health issues. There is increasing stories of the impact of social isolation and domestic violence and hunger and housing difficulties. These are not just stats or stories. These are our brothers and sisters, husbands and wives, their children and their grandparents. If it's not already personal to you, you probably need to get in close until it is personal, and so that it matters. We need to lay aside our safety and our privilege and listen. That's where restoration begins. Perhaps you hear that and you feel overwhelmed. Perhaps you're facing your own crisis, or perhaps you're scared of not having enough to give or running out of resource, be that time or money or skills. The good news is that the invitation to salvation is always to us all. Isaiah 55, which is titled just that, Invitation to Salvation, and it begins, anyone thirsty, come and drink. Even if you've got no money, come, take your choice of wine or milk. It's all free. If you have thirst for water, for milk, for wine, whatever you are looking for, the invitation is to come. He has provision for whatever it is that you need. The funny thing is that the story of how to get there is the same as we find in Nehemiah. We have to be humble enough to go to God's. In him there is provision and there is resource for everything, to quench your thirst and to restore a city. What seems impossible is possible. He's the one who turns everything around. I want to finish just by reading these verses from Isaiah 60. They're both a commissioning and a promise, and you'll have heard them before, but I invite you to listen, to let compassion grow, to make yourself available, and to journey with humility. Free those who are wrongly imprisoned, and lighten the load of those who work for you. Let the oppressed, those who've experienced prolonged or cruel or unjust treatment, go free, and remove the chains, the things that restrict them and bind them up and prevent them moving forwards. Share your food with the hungry and give shelter to the homeless. Give clothes to those who need them, and don't hide from your relatives who need your help. Then your salvation will come like the dawn, and your wounds will quickly heal. Your godliness will lead you forward, and the glory of the Lord will protect you from behind. Then when you call, the Lord will answer, "Yes, I'm here," he'll quickly reply. Remove the heavy yoke of oppression and stop pointing your finger and spreading vicious rumours. Feed the hungry and help those in trouble. Then your light will shine out from the darkness, and the darkness around you will become bright as noon. The Lord will guide you, continually giving you water when you're dry and restoring your strength. You will be like a well-watered garden, like an ever-flowing spring. Your people will build anew on foundations laid long before you. But you will be known as repairers of the cities and restorers of communities.